People don't remember the perfect weddings. They remember the ones that changed someone's life forever. I used to believe that if you loved someone enough, the universe would eventually reward your loyalty. Standing beneath the towering stained glass windows of St. Michael's Cathedral on a crisp October afternoon, I thought my reward had finally arrived. Golden sunlight poured through the colored glass, painting soft blues and crimson reds across the polished marble floor. Fresh white roses lined every pew, their delicate fragrance mixing with the faint scent of candle wax that had drifted through the sanctuary since early morning. Nearly 400 guests filled the historic church, their whispers floating beneath the vaulted ceiling, while a string quartet played somewhere behind me. Every seat held someone important: CEOs, politicians, family friends, reporters pretending they weren't reporters. My wedding had somehow become one of the city's biggest social events, though all I cared about was the man waiting at the altar. Ethan Brooks looked exactly like the magazines always described him: tall, confident, tailored tuxedo, the kind of smile that convinced investors to trust him with billions of dollars. The same smile that had convinced me he would always choose us over everything else. When our eyes met, I felt my heartbeat settle. Maybe every difficult season had led us here. Maybe every sacrifice finally meant something. The minister smiled warmly and invited us to join hands. Ethan reached for mine, his fingers cool against my skin. I noticed the expensive watch peeking beneath his cuff, a gift I had surprised him with after saving for nearly a year. It suddenly felt strangely distant, like it belonged to someone I didn't fully know anymore. The music softened. My father squeezed my shoulder before quietly taking his seat. Tears shimmered in my mother's eyes. I could hear cameras clicking from the back of the cathedral, capturing what everyone assumed would become another perfect society wedding. The minister began speaking about trust, commitment, and choosing one another through every season of life. I listened carefully because every word sounded like a promise I intended to keep. Ethan, however, wasn't listening. His attention drifted toward the inside pocket of his jacket. A faint vibration interrupted the silence. Once, then again. He frowned almost imperceptibly before slipping his phone into his palm beneath the bouquet where he thought no one would notice. I did. His blue eyes scanned the screen for barely 2 seconds. Everything changed. The warmth disappeared from his expression. His shoulders stiffened. The confident groom standing beside me suddenly looked like a businessman calculating numbers instead of a man preparing to say forever. I whispered, "Is everything okay?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the front doors of the cathedral as though someone invisible had just walked inside. Then he inhaled slowly, slid the phone back into his pocket, and gave me a smile that never reached his eyes. "Charlotte," he said quietly enough that only I could hear. "Something important just came up." I laughed softly, expecting a joke. Weddings always came with surprises. Maybe a delayed guest. Maybe a family emergency. Anything but what happened next. Without another word, Ethan released my hand, stepped away from the altar, and adjusted the sleeve of his tuxedo as though preparing for a board meeting instead of a marriage. Every confused face in the cathedral turned toward him while silence spread through the room like a gathering storm. I stood frozen in my white gown, watching the man I loved walk away before we had even spoken our vows, never imagining that within the next hour, someone far more powerful would walk through those cathedral doors and reveal a truth that would leave every person in that room questioning everything they thought they knew. I could hear every whisper even though no one dared to speak above a murmur. The silence inside St. Michael's Cathedral felt heavier than the church itself, pressing against my chest until breathing became something I had to remember to do. Ethan had already reached the center aisle before anyone found the courage to react. His phone remained in his hand, and he never looked back. Not once. The massive wooden doors opened for him as if they had been expecting his departure all along. Cool autumn air rushed inside, carrying the distant sound of traffic and the faint hum of helicopters circling downtown. Somewhere outside, expensive engines came to life. Then he was gone. The doors closed behind him with a deep echo that seemed to announce the end of more than a ceremony. I stood alone beneath the altar, my bouquet suddenly feeling too heavy to hold. The white roses slipped from my fingers one by one until several petals rested across the marble floor. Nobody moved to help me. Nobody knew how. The string quartet had stopped playing halfway through a note, leaving only an uncomfortable stillness hanging over hundreds of guests. The minister quietly lowered his Bible, his sympathetic eyes searching my face for words that did not exist. Across the front row, my mother pressed both hands over her mouth as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. My father remained perfectly still, but I recognized the tightness in his jaw. He had spent his entire life solving impossible problems. This was one he could not fix. Then the whispers began. They traveled from pew to pew like a sudden wind. Someone mentioned the billion-dollar acquisition everyone had been talking about for weeks. Another insisted that Ethan had received an emergency call from overseas investors. A woman wearing an emerald designer suit leaned toward her friend and quietly said that business leaders always had difficult choices to make. I wondered whether she realized I could hear every word. Another guest looked directly at me before shrugging as though I should have expected this. Cameras flashed again. This time they were not celebrating love. They were documenting humiliation. Every bright burst of light reminded me that by sunset, photographs of my abandoned wedding would appear across every news website in the country. My wedding dress, which had felt graceful only minutes earlier, now felt like a costume designed to embarrass me. I wanted to disappear beneath its layers of silk and lace. Instead, I forced myself to remain standing. If I collapsed, they would remember that more than his leaving. Before I could gather my thoughts, Ethan's mother rose from her seat with remarkable composure. Victoria Brooks adjusted her pearl necklace and approached the altar with the same calm expression she always wore during charity galas. She stopped only a few feet away from me. "Charlotte," she said softly enough to sound compassionate while making certain nearby guests could still hear. "Sometimes extraordinary opportunities arrive without warning. Ethan carries responsibilities that affect thousands of employees. Surely you understand." I stared at her, unable to believe what she had just said. She was not apologizing. She was explaining. Worse, she was asking me to accept it. Around us, several executives nodded in agreement. Someone quietly clapped Victoria on the shoulder as though Ethan had accomplished something admirable instead of unforgettable. I finally found my voice. "He walked away from our wedding." My words barely rose above a whisper, yet they echoed through the silent cathedral. Victoria offered a patient smile that never reached her eyes. "He walked toward his future," she replied. "You should try to see the difference." In that moment, I realized something far more painful than being left behind. Everyone inside this cathedral had already decided which story they wanted to believe. And in their version, I was not the woman whose heart had just been broken. I was simply the bride who had failed to compete with a fortune. The weight of hundreds of eyes followed me everywhere I looked. Some carried pity. Others carried curiosity. Too many carried quiet judgment. I bent slowly and gathered the white roses that had scattered across the marble floor, brushing away a trembling hand before one of the wedding coordinators could help me. If this day had taught me anything already, it was that dignity sometimes meant standing on your own even when your heart wanted to fall apart. I took one slow breath after another, trying to silence the roar inside my head. The cathedral had begun to empty in small groups. Conversations grew louder now that people believed the story was over. Guests checked their phones. Reporters whispered into tiny microphones. I caught fragments of headlines before they were even published. Billionaire groom leaves bride at altar. Historic wedding ends in disaster. Business before love. Every sentence reduced my entire life to a spectacle. My father finally climbed the altar steps and wrapped his suit jacket around my shoulders even though the cathedral was warm. His hands shook only once. "Come home," he said quietly. "None of these people deserve another second of your time." I nodded, unable to answer. My mother linked her arm through mine, determined to lead me toward the side entrance away from the cameras gathering outside. We had barely taken 3 steps when an unfamiliar sound echoed through the cathedral. It was not shouting. It was not applause. It was the deep, measured rhythm of polished shoes striking ancient stone. One pair, then another. then several more. Every conversation stopped almost instantly. Even the reporters lowered their microphones. People turned toward the massive entrance doors at exactly the same moment, as though some invisible force had drawn every eye in the room. The cathedral doors opened slowly. Bright afternoon sunlight poured across the floor before dark silhouettes appeared against the light. Four men in perfectly tailored black suits entered first, moving with calm precision rather than intimidation. They spread naturally along the center aisle, not blocking anyone, simply creating space. Behind them walked a man I had never seen before. He looked no older than his early 30s. His charcoal suit fit with effortless elegance, and a long black overcoat rested across his shoulders despite the mild weather outside. Dark hair neatly combed back. Calm gray eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not rush. He did not acknowledge the startled expressions surrounding him. Somehow the entire cathedral seemed to adjust itself around his presence. An older businessman near the front visibly straightened his posture. Two city officials exchanged nervous glances. Even Victoria Brooks lost the practiced confidence she had displayed only moments earlier. I heard someone whisper behind me, almost too quietly to catch. "That is Adrian Moretti." Another voice answered immediately. "What is he doing here?" I did not recognize the name, but judging from the sudden tension spreading across the room, everyone else did. Adrian continued walking until he reached the center of the cathedral. He paused only once, lifting his gaze toward the altar. For a brief second our eyes met. There was no arrogance in his expression, no amusement at my humiliation, only a strange calm that made the room itself feel quieter. One of his associates stepped forward and handed him a slim leather folder. Adrian accepted it without looking away from the front of the church. Then he spoke for the first time. His voice was steady, low, and impossible to ignore. "I apologize for the interruption." He allowed the silence to settle before continuing. "But this ceremony is not over." No one moved. No one questioned him. He slowly turned toward the gathering of guests, executives, and reporters. "Before anyone leaves this cathedral," he said, "there is a truth that every person in this room deserves to hear." No one challenged him. That surprised me more than his arrival. I had never seen a room filled with people so accustomed to influence become so completely silent. Adrian Moretti stood in the center aisle with one hand resting lightly on the leather folder, his expression unreadable beneath the soft afternoon light spilling through the stained glass. Around him, every whispered conversation had vanished. Even the photographers lowered their cameras, sensing that whatever happened next mattered more than another dramatic photograph. Victoria Brooks recovered first. She stepped forward with practiced confidence, smoothing the sleeve of her designer jacket before offering a polite smile that barely concealed her irritation. "Mr. Moretti," she said, "this is a private family matter. I appreciate your concern, but I believe today has already been difficult enough." Adrian regarded her calmly, almost patiently. "You are correct," he replied. "It has been difficult, mostly for the only innocent person standing in this cathedral." His eyes shifted toward me for only a moment before returning to the crowd. The words settled over the room like a quiet verdict. Victoria's smile faded. "If you have business with Ethan, you may arrange it through his office." Adrian slowly shook his head. "This has nothing to do with business." A reporter near the back instinctively reached for a recorder, only to pause when Adrian continued speaking. "This concerns truth, and truth should never arrive after everyone has gone home." My father looked at me with quiet concern, silently asking whether I wanted to leave. Part of me desperately did. Every instinct told me to escape before another painful surprise found me. But something in Adrian's voice held me where I stood. It was not authority alone. It was certainty, the kind that only belonged to someone who already knew the ending of a story everyone else had misunderstood. One of Adrian's associates carried a slim monitor toward the front of the cathedral and placed it beside the altar with careful precision. No one stopped him. No one even asked permission. The guests exchanged uncertain glances as curiosity slowly replaced sympathy. I realized the room had shifted. Minutes earlier, everyone had been watching me. Now every eye followed Adrian. He opened the leather folder and removed several neatly organized documents. There was no theatrical gesture, no attempt to impress anyone. His movements were measured, almost respectful, as though he understood that truth did not require dramatic performance. It only required patience. Most of you believe that Ethan Brooks abandoned this wedding because of an unexpected billion-dollar opportunity, Adrian said. Several executives nodded immediately. One even murmured, "Exactly." Adrian acknowledged the response with the slightest inclination of his head. That explanation was delivered very quickly. He allowed another brief silence to pass. Perhaps too quickly. I felt my pulse quicken. Something inside me whispered that the story I had spent the last 30 minutes trying to accept was beginning to crack. Adrian looked toward the front row where several members of Ethan's board of directors sat frozen in place. "How many of you received identical messages within the last 15 minutes explaining his absence?" A few uneasy expressions answered before anyone spoke. Finally, one executive slowly raised his hand. Then another. Soon nearly half the board had done the same. Adrian nodded as though confirming something he had expected all along. "Interesting," he said softly. "Prepared statements usually travel faster than the truth." A ripple of uncertainty spread through the cathedral. People reached for their phones, rereading messages they had accepted without question only moments earlier. Faces that had been filled with confidence now showed hesitation. Victoria folded her arms tightly across her chest. "What exactly are you implying?" she demanded. Adrian closed the folder with quiet precision and met her gaze without raising his voice. "I am implying nothing." His gray eyes swept across the cathedral until they finally rested on me once more. "I am here to prove that Charlotte Hayes was never abandoned for a business deal. She was abandoned because someone believed a carefully constructed lie would never be challenged. Unfortunately for them, I brought the evidence before they had the chance to erase it." The moment Adrian finished speaking, the cathedral no longer felt like a place of celebration. It felt like a courtroom where every heartbeat waited for a verdict. Nobody reached for the exits. Nobody even glanced toward the doors anymore. Every face turned toward the monitor standing beside the altar. My own breathing had become slow and deliberate, as though some quiet instinct warned me that the next few minutes would separate everything I had believed from everything that had actually happened. Adrian placed the folder on a nearby table and nodded once to the associate standing beside the monitor. The screen flickered to life, filling the front of the cathedral with the image of a digital calendar marked with dates stretching back nearly 4 months. "A billion-dollar acquisition did exist," Adrian said calmly. "That part of the story is true." Several executives exchanged relieved glances, believing his statement supported Ethan's explanation. Adrian allowed that confidence to settle before continuing. "What is not true is the claim that today's wedding interrupted it." A second image appeared. It showed official scheduling documents, meeting confirmations, and electronic signatures, each carrying dates from weeks earlier. "The final agreement was completed 43 days ago," Adrian explained. "Every required signature had already been submitted. Every financial approval had already been secured. There was no emergency negotiation today. No urgent board meeting. No investor waiting for Ethan Brooks this afternoon." A quiet murmur spread through the cathedral. One member of Ethan's board stepped closer to the screen, adjusting his glasses before studying the dates with visible confusion. "That cannot be right," he whispered. Adrian looked toward him respectfully. "Your own company's records disagree." Another document appeared beside the first. Then another. Every timestamp matched perfectly. Every approval had been finalized long before wedding invitations had even been mailed. I watched the expressions around me begin to change. Confidence dissolved into uncertainty. Uncertainty slowly became disbelief. Victoria Brooks folded her arms tighter across her chest. "Anyone can manufacture paperwork," she said sharply. Adrian nodded as though he had expected the objection. "Which is why I never rely on one source." He motioned toward the screen again. A secure video recording appeared, displaying a corporate conference room from several weeks earlier. Ethan sat at the end of the polished table surrounded by attorneys and financial advisors. The recording carried both the company logo and an official archive timestamp. One attorney smiled across the table and extended a hand. "Congratulations, everyone. The acquisition is officially complete." Ethan returned the handshake with obvious satisfaction. Another executive laughed. "Now you can enjoy your wedding without thinking about work." Ethan smiled and answered without hesitation. "Exactly. By the time the ceremony arrives, this deal will already be old news." The recording ended. Silence rushed back into the cathedral with astonishing force. I felt something inside me collapse, but it was not my heart this time. It was the last excuse I had been desperately trying to believe. Ethan had not chosen business over me. Business had never required that choice in the first place. My father slowly exhaled beside me. My mother covered her eyes as tears slipped between her fingers again, but now they carried a different kind of pain. Around the cathedral, guests stared at one another, replaying the recording in their minds. Reporters who had spent the last half hour preparing stories about ambition and sacrifice quietly deleted notes from their phones. Adrian remained perfectly composed. He did not celebrate. He did not accuse. He simply allowed the evidence to speak for itself. Then he looked directly at the gathering of executives and asked one simple question. If the acquisition ended 43 days ago, then what exactly convinced Ethan Brooks to walk away from the woman waiting for him at the altar today? No one answered Adrian's question. The silence that followed felt almost alive, stretching across the cathedral until even the smallest sound became impossible to ignore. I could hear someone shifting in a wooden pew. A camera lens clicked softly. Somewhere near the entrance, a guest cleared his throat before thinking better of it. Every face reflected the same uneasy realization. The explanation they had accepted so easily was falling apart piece by piece. Adrian remained completely still. He did not pressure anyone to respond. Instead, he opened the leather folder once more and removed a thin stack of printed emails secured with a silver clip. People often believe lies because the first version of a story arrives before the truth, he said quietly. Fortunately, digital records are far less emotional than people. His associate placed another document onto the monitor. It displayed a series of corporate emails exchanged over several months. Names, dates, and timestamps appeared clearly across the screen. Adrian did not rush through them. He allowed every person in the cathedral enough time to read. One message immediately caught everyone's attention. It had been sent by Ethan to a private consultant nearly 3 weeks before the wedding. The subject line read, "Reputation Management." My heartbeat quickened as Adrian calmly summarized its contents. Mr. Brooks requested a public narrative that would protect his personal image if he chose to end today's ceremony unexpectedly. A collective gasp moved through the cathedral. Victoria Brooks stepped forward. "You are taking private correspondence out of context." Adrian met her objection without the slightest change in expression. "Then let us add the context." Another email appeared beneath the first. Then another. Together they outlined discussions about preserving investor confidence, controlling media headlines, and ensuring that any public embarrassment would appear unavoidable rather than intentional. One sentence seemed to freeze the entire room. If the departure can be connected to corporate responsibility, public sympathy will remain favorable. My knees suddenly felt weak. Those words were not written in anger. They were not written during an argument. They had been planned with cold precision long before I walked down the aisle. I was never part of an unexpected tragedy. I had become part of a carefully designed public relations strategy. Around me, several board members slowly lowered their eyes. One elderly investor quietly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead as though trying to erase what he had just read. The reporters who had been recording every word exchanged astonished looks before continuing to type as quickly as their fingers allowed. Adrian folded his hands calmly in front of him. There is still more. A final file appeared on the screen. This one contained messages between Ethan and a financial advisor discussing the potential effect that marrying into my family's charitable foundation might have on future business relationships. There was no cruelty in the language. Somehow that made it worse. Every sentence treated my life like a line in a spreadsheet. Benefits, risks, public perception, timing. Not once did anyone mention love. Not once did anyone ask whether I deserved honesty. I stared at the screen until the words became difficult to focus on. My memories of engagement dinners, wedding planning, and whispered promises suddenly rearranged themselves into something unrecognizable. My father gently reached for my hand without saying a word. His grip reminded me that at least one thing in my world had never been calculated. Adrian finally closed the folder and looked across the room. Power often convinces people that they can control every version of the truth, he said. But there is one mistake they always make. He paused, allowing every eye to remain fixed on him. They assume no one else has been paying attention. I stopped looking at the monitor. I stopped looking at the guests. I even stopped looking for Ethan, as though some part of me had finally accepted that the man I thought I loved had never truly existed. Instead, I looked down at the diamond ring resting on my left hand. Just an hour earlier it had symbolized forever. Now it felt strangely heavy, like a promise made to someone else entirely. I turned it slowly with my thumb, remembering the night Ethan had slipped it onto my finger beneath the lights of the Brooklyn Bridge. He had smiled and told me that every success in his life would mean nothing if he could not share it with me. I had believed every word because I wanted to believe the man saying them. The cathedral remained silent while I gently pulled the ring free. The tiny sound of metal leaving my finger somehow echoed louder than every whispered rumor that had filled the room all afternoon. My mother reached toward me instinctively, but I gave her a small smile that asked her not to worry. For the first time since Ethan had walked away, my hands were no longer shaking. My voice, when it finally came, surprised even me. It was calm. I spent months wondering whether I was enough, I said, looking across the rows of guests. Pretty enough, successful enough, patient enough. I kept believing that if I loved harder, everything else would somehow fall into place. No one interrupted. Even the reporters lowered their phones for a moment. Today I learned something different, I continued. You cannot earn honesty from someone who already decided to replace it with convenience. I looked down at the ring one last time before placing it gently on the white cloth covering the altar. There was no anger in the gesture, only acceptance. This belongs to a future that no longer exists. A tear slipped down my cheek, but I did not wipe it away. I no longer felt embarrassed by it. Tears were honest. The lies had belonged to someone else. Victoria Brooks opened her mouth as though preparing another explanation, but stopped when she realized nobody was listening anymore. The sympathy she had expected for her son had quietly disappeared. Around the cathedral, people who had judged me only minutes earlier now avoided meeting my eyes. Several guests who had whispered that business came first lowered their heads in visible regret. An elderly woman in the third row stood first. Then another guest. Soon a quiet wave of people rose to their feet, not in celebration, but in respect. They were not applauding a wedding. They were acknowledging someone who had chosen dignity over humiliation. I felt my father squeeze my shoulder. "That is my daughter," he whispered, his voice breaking with pride. Adrian remained exactly where he had been since entering the cathedral. He neither encouraged the moment nor claimed any credit for it. His expression remained calm, almost distant, as though he understood that some victories belonged entirely to the person who earned them. Our eyes met again across the sanctuary. This time I saw something I had missed before. Respect. Nothing more. Nothing less. He had not come to rescue me. He had simply refused to let a lie become my identity. I drew one slow breath and looked around the cathedral that had witnessed both my greatest heartbreak and my greatest awakening. "This wedding is over," I said quietly. "But my life is not." The words settled into the silence with unexpected strength. For the first time all day, I no longer felt like the abandoned bride standing at the altar. I felt like the woman walking away from a future she had finally realized she deserved to leave behind. The applause faded slowly, replaced by something far more powerful than noise. Respect. I had spent months imagining what my wedding day would sound like. I expected laughter, music, and promises. Instead, I heard quiet conversations changing direction in real time. The same guests who had accepted Ethan's explanation only minutes earlier were now rereading the evidence on their phones with expressions that shifted from confusion to disappointment. Several board members gathered near the front pews, speaking in low voices that carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. One executive who had defended Ethan earlier slowly approached my father. "Mr. Hayes," he said with genuine regret, "I owe your family an apology. We accepted a story without asking whether it was true." My father simply nodded. "The truth eventually asks for its own turn." Those words lingered with me. They felt simple, yet somehow stronger than every polished speech I had heard at corporate galas over the years. Victoria Brooks remained frozen near the altar, surrounded by people who no longer seemed eager to comfort her. She glanced repeatedly toward her phone, reading message after message as new notifications continued arriving. Even from several feet away, I could see the color slowly leave her face. The carefully managed narrative she had defended so confidently was collapsing faster than anyone could contain it. A member of Ethan's board stepped toward Adrian with visible concern. "Is this information already public?" he asked quietly. Adrian answered without triumph. "Not yet. What becomes public depends entirely on the choices made after today." The executive lowered his eyes, understanding exactly what those words meant. Around the cathedral, reporters who had originally prepared headlines about a groom choosing business over love were now rewriting every sentence. Cameras that had once pointed at me now focused on the evidence displayed beside the altar. The story had changed because the truth had finally caught up with the lie. Adrian's associate quietly disconnected the monitor and gathered the documents with the same professionalism that had marked every movement since their arrival. There was no celebration among them, no smiles. They behaved as though exposing the truth was not an extraordinary event but simply the correct thing to do. I found myself watching Adrian more closely. Power had surrounded him from the moment he entered the cathedral, yet he never demanded attention. He never raised his voice. He never humiliated anyone simply because he could. Somehow that restraint made his presence even more commanding. One reporter cautiously approached him. "Mr. Moretti, are you representing Charlotte Hayes?" Adrian shook his head once. "No." "Then why intervene?" the reporter asked. Adrian looked briefly toward the stained glass above the altar before answering. "Because silence would have rewarded deception. Nothing more. Nothing less." The reporter lowered his notebook, apparently realizing there was nothing to add to an answer that complete. I looked around the cathedral one final time. The flowers remained beautiful. The candles still burned quietly. The white aisle runner still stretched toward the altar exactly as it had an hour earlier. Only the people had changed. The room that had witnessed public humiliation had now witnessed public accountability. Not because someone sought revenge, but because facts had refused to remain hidden. As my parents and I prepared to leave, several guests stepped aside without being asked, creating a clear path through the center aisle. No one stared anymore. No one whispered. They simply offered respectful nods as I passed. For the first time that day, I no longer felt like the center of a scandal. I felt like someone finally walking free from one. Behind me, the cathedral doors slowly opened again, filling the sanctuary with warm afternoon light. I stepped toward it without looking back, unaware that one quiet conversation waiting just outside those doors would reveal the real reason Adrian Moretti had chosen this day, this place, and my story above every other battle he could have fought. Sometimes the greatest gift is not finding the person you imagined you needed. It is discovering the person you become after walking away. The afternoon sun felt warmer as I stepped outside St. Michael's Cathedral. A gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn leaves through the city streets, lifting the edge of my wedding veil before I quietly removed it from my hair. I folded the delicate fabric carefully over my arm. It no longer represented a promise waiting to be fulfilled. It represented a chapter that had reached its rightful ending. Reporters stood behind the security barriers lining the front steps, but something had changed. They no longer shouted insensitive questions or searched for dramatic reactions. Instead, they stepped aside respectfully, allowing my parents and me to walk through without interruption. A few simply nodded. Others lowered their cameras. Somehow, silence had become the greatest kindness they could offer. As we reached the final step, I heard calm footsteps behind us. I turned to find Adrian approaching alone. His associates remained several yards away, giving us privacy without being asked. For the first time all afternoon, he looked less like the powerful figure who had commanded an entire cathedral and more like an ordinary man carrying the weight of an old memory. He stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Hayes," he said, "there is one thing I should have told you before I walked inside." I waited quietly. 20 years ago, he continued, your father made a decision that changed my family's life. I looked at my father in confusion. He smiled faintly, almost as though he had expected this conversation for years. Adrian glanced toward him before continuing. When my father lost everything, very few people treated him with dignity. Your father did. He gave him honest work when no one else would. He refused to judge him for circumstances he could not control. That single act allowed my family to begin again. My father shook his head gently. I simply hired a good man. Adrian smiled for the first time. It was quiet, genuine, and remarkably free of pride. To you, perhaps. To us, it became the reason we never forgot your name. I felt tears gather again, but they were no longer born from grief. They came from realizing that kindness has a way of surviving long after the people who offered it stop expecting anything in return. Adrian looked back at me. Today was never about revenge. It was about protecting the dignity your family once gave mine. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The city continued moving around us. Taxis passed. Church bells rang somewhere in the distance. Life, completely unaware of how profoundly mine had changed, simply continued forward. Finally, I smiled. A real smile. Not because my pain had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled me. "Thank you," I whispered. Adrian inclined his head politely. "You do not owe me thanks." He turned toward the waiting black sedan but paused before opening the door. Without looking back, he said, "Do not measure your future by the person who failed to see your worth. Measure it by the courage you found when you stood alone." Then he entered the car, and within moments it disappeared into the steady flow of afternoon traffic. I watched until it vanished from sight before turning toward my parents. Together we walked away from the cathedral, leaving behind the flowers, the photographs, the broken expectations, and every lie that had tried to define me. I did not leave as someone abandoned at the altar. I left as a woman who finally understood that dignity cannot be taken by another person's choice, can only be surrendered by your own. And on that unforgettable autumn afternoon, I chose to carry mine with me into whatever tomorrow would become.